proposition has presented this great ideal world where we're able to prioritize climate change over economic growth without apparently needing the economic growth. Now, we think that this does not make sense. To prioritize climate change, you need economic growth. So as a side opposition, we believe that these two things aren't mutually exclusive. We're not saying we should ignore climate change altogether. Instead, we are saying that in certain countries, it is important to prioritize economic growth, and it is important to fuel these things first, because they haven't really presented a world where we don't need the economy to prioritize climate change. So I will be addressing this in the clashes I'm addressing today. So one of the clashes I want to mention is, what does prioritizing these citizens look like? So they make this one of the main arguments of their things. They're saying that when they're prioritizing climate change, they are therefore prioritizing their citizens. So here's what we think. Climate change will help citizens maybe in the long term, and we do concede to that point. However, certain nations do need to prioritize short-term things, which my partner did mention. Certain countries need to prioritize other things, like for things such as war, poverty, all those other things. And right now, climate change isn't their primary concern. I'll take it now.
Note that climate change doesn't need to be the #1 priority, it just needs to be a priority over economic growth. War, fine, we can prioritize that as well. That's what the debate is about.
Yes, we acknowledge this, but we are saying that in helping to fund these other things, that it therefore helps the economic growth, which I will expand on in my thing. So, certain nations do need to prioritize these short-term things, like I said, because it is more important. But we've explained, well, the proposition has tried to say how climate change helps their citizens, which we do say in the long term. But what we argue, that rather you need the economy for these kinds of things. So in certain nations, even though they have stated that in certain nations the priorities are different for others, but we still do think that in these nations it's important to prioritize the economic growth to help fulfill these short-term things rather than fulfill climate change first. We're simply reordering the order of things to prioritize economic growth first, because that can help climate change, and the list goes down, if that makes sense. So I'll go down what the proposition has proposed their model looks like. So they said there's an economic front, a social front, and a diplomatic front. But let's look at this in detail, okay? So the economic front. So they're saying that they're putting more resources into climate change things. Our argument, how can you put more resources into climate change related things if we do not have the money for this? In fact, this is our thing. Like I mentioned before, climate change and economic growth isn't mutually exclusive, which I'm going to expand on. So in the status quo, let's look at the countries that do actually prioritize climate change. They're economically stable and they're economically strong. Countries like Scotland, Sweden, New Zealand. Those are countries which do prioritize climate change, and they are revered for their environmental thing. But those countries are able to do that because they have the money, because they're able to invest in these sorts of things, because they can invest in electric car charging things, because they can invest in solar panels, and all forms of alternate sustainable power. So in general, the proposition said that we must have resources allocated, but where are we getting these resources? However, in this perfect world where even where you are, smaller countries are forced to do that, and larger countries which aren't. Smaller countries which do not actually make the impact are therefore forced to help prioritize climate change, but then larger countries, that doesn't really make sense. If the smaller countries are not actually making the impact for climate change, if they're not actually, impacting it in those ways, why should they have to put in the same percentage amount of effort for their thing? Yes?
We're literally not saying that. We're saying they won't have to put in the same amount of effort. They'll put in an effort that is prioritizing in their sense of the word, in their individual example of that country. Each country will have a different level of this based on the resources they already have.
Yes, so we do say this. I did mention that, why I said percentage in particular, percentage of that country. So in implying that in the different types of how each country contributes, I'm assuming that there will be this kind of percentage expectation based on the GDP. They didn't really clarify this, but we just assumed this as opposition. So in saying that, these countries will have to, contribute their resources to climate change when it could be contributed to something else because it directly impacts their people. And yes, this could be because of climate change, like the poverty that is in place, but those are more short-term things. Instead of prioritizing climate change over it, they should be prioritizing economic growth, therefore health. So economic growth should be prioritized first. But anyway, I'll move on to the social front, which they mentioned. So they mentioned education. They didn't really mention how they will get all the money for all this, how they're going to educate these programs, how they're going to implement this. Of course, they did say that it looks different in different countries, but they didn't mention what this is actually going to look like. And then in the diplomatic front, well, we think this is somewhat problematic. So if you don't prioritize climate change over economic growth, will there just be a trade sanction on you? If you choose to not do this, if you choose to not do economic growth, if you choose to do all that, are you simply saying that they will be punished for not having this choice, that these countries will be making that choice to, punish these countries which don't actually go through that? Well, yeah, why are they being punished for things which they choose to prioritize in the short term? We believe that this is something that is problematic, especially for smaller countries. So my partner and I believe that certain countries are more responsible for climate change than others. And yes, even though proposition does proceed to that by saying that certain countries do contribute more, we think it's unfair in their definition of countries being all countries in the UN for that to apply to all countries, which is what my proposition mentioned. Why should all countries have to prioritize climate change in this manner? Yes, they did mention, yes, you can prioritize other things over that, but we believe, as side opposition, that they need to prioritize economic growth first. Because where can they go to prioritizing climate change if they do not have economic growth in the first place? Not right now. So, right now, if we're looking at this, smaller countries are normally the ones that are suffering. So why should they be the ones that prioritize climate change? Like they said, and like the proposition will keep on telling you, yes, there's other things they need to prioritize over that. But if we think about it, like I said before, how are they going to prioritize climate change if they don't have this? If they don't have the economy to be able to do that? They need to focus on the economic growth so they are able to protect their country for things like climate change and all those sorts of things, but they can't do it right away. Yes, I'll take it now.
You realize you're talking a lot about economic growth and all of its benefits, but you haven't given us a clear idea of what it actually looks like and why it impacts all of the areas you're talking about in these countries.
Well, I don't understand with your model where you have stated that climate change and economic growth is mutually exclusive. We are saying this in our thing. You can prioritize economic growth first, and we can still prioritize climate change over that. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. We can grow the economy, and we can prioritizing in whatever the proposition says in solar panels and all those kinds of things. But when we are doing economic growth, no, I think that's too soon anyway. With economic growth, with the economic growth, when you're growing the economy and you are able to allocate it to certain resources, and that can include climate change, even though, we do think that there are other things that certain countries do need to prioritize first, even though proposition has said they can prioritize those things first, but you know what I mean. Okay. So another clash that I have realized is what the priority of these nations actually are. So I mentioned that they're not mutually exclusive, and we both agree that we need to protect their citizens, but we have different ways in how we think that this can play out. So proposition believes that we can protect our citizens through this climate change and through prioritizing climate change over economic growth. But as side opposition, we believe the opposite. We believe that we need to prioritize economic growth over climate change because those things aren't exactly mutually exclusive. So I'll take it.
But what is economic growth exactly? You haven't given us a clear idea of what that looks like in all of these countries you're talking about.
Well, in economic growth in general, it's simply, making decisions that will fulfill your economy, that will allow your economy to grow. So instead of allocating resources to maybe solar panels, maybe you're allocating it to, a tourist thing that will allow economic growth to happen. Think something, allocating the resources differently to allow the economy to grow. So in this tourist example, which, let's just say it's just an example, don't quote me on this, just an example. In this tourist example, in allocating those things, tourists are able to go there, and you're able to, have you're able to have tourists there, and they can buy in shops and stuff like that, and now grow the economy and those kind of things. So instead of allocating it in things like solar panels, you're able to allocate it in those kind of things, which grow the economy. But the thing is, their side is mutually exclusive with our one. If you're allocating things to something that doesn't necessarily propel economic growth, such as solar panels and stuff like that, you're not necessarily growing the economy in that manner. However, in our one, in our tourist example or whatever example, you can allocate the resources there, you can grow the economy, and then you can help climate change, instead of prioritizing it first. So we're not saying, mutually exclusive and all sorts of that. We're just saying those kinds of things. And it is for these reasons that we are proud to oppose.
8:43.